want to thank you for joining us today. This is a topic that I personally enjoy discussing, so I'm excited to share some of the details about it with you today. Just one quick note before we get started. If you have any questions during the webinar, please feel free to type them into the questions box in the Zoom control panel. We'll be answering all of those at the end of the webinar. Questions will be anonymous and responses will come at the end of the presentation, so no need to be shy there. We'll make sure that we get anything that you need taken care of. With that said, let's get into today's presentation. So as Will mentioned, today we're going to talk about how to use mobile phone data in car collision cases. Just kind of a quick agenda here. We're going to go through a brief introduction, kind of do a state of the union just to make sure we're all on the same page. We'll talk about the available mobile phone data. We'll also talk about how to preserve that data. We'll get into some of the preservation and analysis protocols to make sure that you're working properly with all parties involved to get all of that data properly preserved and analyzed. We'll go over some things to consider, some pitfalls, some gotcha moments, things of that nature. We'll then kind of wrap up with some case studies, some key takeaways, and then we'll get into that Q&A session there. Want to start out with just this brief quote. This is Jack Dorsey, who was the co-founder or is the co-founder of Twitter. And until late 2021, he was the CEO of Twitter. His definition of technology is that technology to him does two things. It increases the velocity of communication and it increases the number of people who can participate in that. I cannot agree with him more on that. And that velocity of communication, number of people involved heavily impacts where we are today with mobile phone data, but technology in general. As I mentioned, we'll kind of walk through a quick state of the union. So let's look at some stats on mobile devices. Now, this is a chart from the Pew Research Group. They do a lot of great studies, but a lot of good ones on technology as well. Kind of just basically want to set the precedent here that where smartphone ownership, social media is currently, and how it's been growing over the last few years and probably where it's going to continue to grow. So if we look at the charts here for the under 50 group, when it comes to owning a smartphone, 95% or more of US citizens own a smartphone. Similarly, on that under 50 group, 81% or above use social media every single day. Over the last 9 years, we could see that ownership margin has, from oldest to youngest, has shrunk from 53 to 35 points, and the social media shrunk from 71 to 39. Both of those are only going to continue to shrink further as younger folks become adults and that kind of middle of the road group gets older and older. So we can expect these numbers are probably going to continue to rise. In the same study, they also found that nearly 50% of the 18 to 29-year-old demographic report being online almost constantly. I would guarantee that that bleeds over into time behind the wheel, both from just a basic logic standpoint, but also from actually seeing it firsthand over and over. You've probably seen it when you're driving around. You'll see people either looking down in their lap or, phone out front and center while they're driving. It's pretty typical, but I see it pretty regularly at my job as well, just from doing these sorts of cases over and over and over. While it's lower, even if we go up to the 50-year-old demographic, we still see that almost 42% of those individuals are constantly online. Basically, the summary of this is it's going to lead to a lot of distracted driving incidents. To further drive the point of distracted driving home, studies have shown that approximately 70% of Americans check their phones within 5 minutes of receiving a notification. And while that study found that only 35% of Americans use or look at their phone while driving, I think that number is likely heavily understated. Admitting that answer in several states is essentially akin to admitting you commit a crime every time you drive. So I would make the argument that that number is probably lower than what it actually is. But regardless of what that true number might be, it's clear that the chances of distracted driving are fairly high in today's day and age. Americans just cannot put those phones down. Again, as you see on the slide here, Americans on average check their phone 344 times a day, once every 4 minutes. I mean, that's just, the frequency of it is just unfathomable sometimes. Again, with the latest stats here, this is a map of the United States with the percentage change of traffic fatalities from 2020 to 2021 by state. You can, feel free to take a deeper look at this, but as a summary, 5 out of the 50 states decreased by 1 to 20%. Only 8 increased by 20% or more. Everybody else fell in between. So it's, by and large, they are all increasing. It's just a matter of by how much. And when you look at the data on the other slides prior to this, it makes perfect sense why this is happening, especially with everybody coming out of COVID. You've got kids that, didn't really drive a lot when there were a lot of other individuals on the road. Maybe they got their test and there just wasn't a lot going on. So it's easier to drive distracted because there's not as much vehicles on the road. You're less likely to impact one of those. So let's talk about what sorts of data could potentially be available from these devices. Now, when it comes to smartphones, it starts with 1 or 2 apps, Facebook, text, and then before you know it, you've got hundreds of apps on your phone. You've probably seen this, you buy a phone, you're all happy, it's nice and clean, there's very few things on it. As time goes on, you just install those apps, you keep installing them, and eventually everything is there. Now, with the prevalence of data stored on the devices, this led Supreme Court Chief Justice Roberts to this famous quote. Now, this was in the Riley versus California case, but his quote is, "Mobile devices are such a pervasive and insistent part of daily life that the proverbial visitor from Mars might conclude they were an important feature of human anatomy." And we've all probably experienced this yourselves. You leave your house, you forget your smartphone at home. It's kind of one of those things where about 5 or 10 minutes goes by once you're out the door, and you kind of feel like something's off, and you're wondering if you left your pants at home. You start feeling around at your pockets, and you realize it was your cell phone. And almost every single time, you're going to run right back into that house, turn the car around, do whatever you need to get back there and get that. Because if you don't have that phone, your entire day is off. The upside is that with that, part where it feels like it's part of your body, it's an extension of your being. We also get lots of good digital forensic aspects from that as well. Now, let's talk about how phones collect data. So applications use the framework from a phone's operating system. They do that and they access and use various features of your phone. So Instagram might ask to use your camera, for instance. Uber might ask to use your location. You see the screenshot on the right hand here. You've probably seen something like this before if you're an iPhone user. Android has, similar requests that they'll make when you're either downloading, installing apps, configuring them. On the right is one of Maps. Very straightforward, just asking to use your location. Makes complete and total sense. Obviously, you need to know your location while you're using a Maps navigation program. But what happens is when you click that OK, that allow, you're basically opting into creating digital forensics artifacts. Applications do vary greatly by the developer and by the version. One app version may store the data on your phone, the next may store it in your cloud, could be in between, kind of a hybrid. App data is typically going to be stored in databases. Those databases can sometimes be encrypted as well, which can complicate the way that we access it. It could complicate deleted recovery, all different aspects there. And then another thing to consider is the data in protected storage. Protected storage is essentially a flag that developers can use. So when they're making an app, they can assign that flag that basically says, don't back up this data. I view it as protected. Traditionally, we saw this applied more to health-based data, but over time, it's become more commonplace among just routine run-of-the-mill apps. This can complicate things on the forensic side of things because simply requiring elevated access rights is not always as straightforward as it seems. So it can make getting access to that protected data a little bit more difficult. We'll talk about a couple of scenarios with that later. Now, what is the data? So with this slide, I want to focus solely on the mobile OS, or the mobile operating system. So it's operating system-based activity, such as native artifacts. Think about the kinds of things that come out of the box when you buy your phone brand new. You never log into a cloud account. You never set up the phone using a prior device, transfer your contacts in, anything like that. So it's going to be more basic activities. We're going to see things like calls and text messages. We're going to see things like wireless network connections, saved wireless networks, things of that nature. Bluetooth activity, devices that may have been connected to the phone from using the Bluetooth protocols, what time those devices may have been connected, and various other aspects like that. And lastly, data and app usage, which is to say information about the data being transferred to or from the device, but also how the applications are being used on the device. As an example, various artifacts are created when you're navigating between apps. That can come in the form of screenshots of the activity that you've done. These are often screenshots that are generated on the back end. The user has no involvement whatsoever. It's not the same as a screenshot where if you're familiar with taking a screenshot, a lot of times you press the power button at the same time that you press one of the volume toggles. This is not that. This is an auto-generated screenshot created for user experience purposes. So the next time you open that app, it previews a little faster. But it can also be logging to indicate which app was the focal point on the phone. So in other words, what is the foreground app that you're currently looking at on June 12th, 2021 at 7:08 a.m. Versus what was the app that was sent to the background. So the one that you looked at say 7:06 a.m. on that same day. Switching over to the actual real application data. So these are things that get built on top of the mobile operating system. We have third-party messages. Now those can run the spectrum of very straightforward apps like WhatsApp, which simply allows you to easily communicate with anyone across different countries. If you don't have a mobile plan, WhatsApp, if you're not familiar with it, is a great app. It allows you to communicate with people day to day. You can go anywhere if they have a wireless network, and you can basically text with people without having a mobile plan. On the completely other side of that, taking a much more secure standpoint, it could also be something like Snapchat, which is designed to securely delete messages, if the user requests that. So third-party messages can run that whole spectrum, but those are additional things beyond the operating system. Of course, there's also the social media apps, your Facebooks, your Twitters, your Instagrams, and so have you. We also have some vehicle-specific apps. Now, things like Honda Link, Tesla's apps, you may be asking, like, why is he even talking about these? These are, completely irrelevant. But the question I want to ask you is, say someone has a Tesla, they use Tesla's autopilot feature in the app, and they summon their vehicle or they park that vehicle using the autopilot feature. During the course of that process, there happens to be a collision. It doesn't matter whether it's with another vehicle, with a concrete pylon, anything. But what happens in that scenario? Who's at fault? Knowing the technology that is in play there, and being able to ask those questions, being aware that these vehicle-specific apps can allow you to do things like this sometimes, those can help you determine very important details in these sorts of cases. We also have carrier-specific apps. So insurance carriers have their own apps now. You've probably seen them or either advertised. You may even have them installed on your phone. Things like State Farm's Drive Safe and Save app. Root Insurance is a big one. They're kind of the uncarrier. They're almost like the T-Mobile of insurance. They're trying to shake things up, and you only pay what you should be paying based on your driving behaviors. They calculate your scores. They either reward or punish you based on that driving. But to calculate that information, they first need to track and log your behavioral data first. Also, health data is present as well. This is certainly not an exhaustive list, though. We've got a handful here. You're probably familiar with all of these logos, but to further complicate the amount of potential data sources to consider, I want to just, drop a couple of facts on you. This is a graph of the Google Play Store and the number of available apps over time. Most recently, as of 2022, the first quarter, there were over 2.5 million apps in the Google Play Store. Then we have Apple, of course, being the 800-pound gorilla that they are. They are closing in on 5 million apps. I'm going to date myself a little bit here, but I remember the days back in the beginning when there were 100,000 apps between the two of them. Those were simpler times. Mobile forensics was different, but the number of apps that you had to, manually parse was much smaller as well. But I want to mention the number of apps because we'll come back to this a couple of times throughout this presentation. The number of apps out there has drastically changed the way that we do forensics day to day. And it does draw a firm distinction between, kind of like a hobbyist who does forensics a couple of times a year against someone who does it every single day. Now let's get into how to preserve. So the mobile device landscape has drastically changed and always changes. First and foremost, it moves fast, lightning fast. Used to be a time when everything was, pretty unsecure. If you had the determination and the time, you could get into most any device and get the things that you needed. The older devices used to have weaker security, and now it's a never-ending game of catch-up for the tools and the examiners both. Phone manufacturers are extremely privacy conscious nowadays. Gone are the days when Apple used to help law enforcement break into a phone, or very straightforward, kind of hidden, simple button combinations allowed you to bypass locks. Security is now baked in by default. A lot of the vendors have actually even engineered themselves out of the process, so they can't even help when they're compelled to. Now, Apple and Google are kind of the big ones. Of course, Samsung, LG, Motorola, they are taking most of the time Android and just putting it in theirs, and they're putting their own skin on top of it. But that is adding an extra layer of security as well. So a Samsung phone running Android is going to be handled a lot differently than an LG phone running Android. Samsung is going to have extra things. They may have Samsung Knox on it. So they've all got their own additional software and security that they'll put on top of that base Android layer. As I mentioned, the security going up, encryption is now becoming the standard. If you don't have a PIN, a lot of times it can be pretty difficult to get through. Biometrics are getting better and better. Face ID is using infrared now, so it's actually detecting temperatures. They also use depth detection. When it initially came out, sometimes you could use a picture. Then over time, they got a little bit better. You had to cut out holes in the eyes so you could actually have a real person with eyes looking through. And now pictures just don't work anymore. Now, as with all technology, mobile devices do come with flaws. We refer to those as vulnerabilities. They are out there, but they are expensive and rare. You may have heard of checkmate or check-rain if you've been doing forensics and working with, with experts in the field for a while. You may have come across that on various court documents, or they may have mentioned it to you in conversation. Those are specific to the iOS ecosystem. There's also a set of just various hardware flaws. There can be chipset development issues. So depending on the hardware that's actually placed in a device, someone does some reverse engineering and they end up finding a flaw in that. And if you're able to, you can commercialize that and actually make a pretty decent amount of money selling those back to various firms. They also have what's called 0 days. These kind of can either be hardware or they can be software based. So these are very difficult to patch in some cases. A 0 day is basically something that has been known for 0 days. So it's something that the vendor is not aware of. It's kind of a off the record flaw, if you will. Vendors will sometimes commercialize this and sell it out to forensic firms. Sometimes forensic firms will find and develop their own 0 days. And those will allow you to get extra information there, through elevated security rights. The good thing about these hardware flaws and these 0 days is a lot of times when they're found, and especially with the hardware flaws, the ability for a vendor to patch these can be very timely and very difficult, and in some cases it's impossible. If you think about if you've ever I'm sure everybody here has probably gotten recalls on their vehicles. Imagine a recall on your phone. Imagine if everybody that owned an iPhone 12 had to bring it into the Apple store and get a brand new one. It's just something that's probably not going to happen. They might replace a few here and there, but for the most part, they're going to focus on patching it the best they can and moving on to prevent it from affecting further phones. Now, when it comes to preserving mobile data, there are many ways to accomplish that. Of course, the easiest way to preserve data for a non-techie person is to take the device offline and essentially shelve the device. Very straightforward, no technical skills whatsoever to do that. If it's off the network, turned off, you've got the PIN code or passcode, what have you, that's great. But once we get past that, we get to the more involved aspect of actually acquiring the devices and data. One thing we need to keep in mind throughout this entire presentation and digital forensics in general is that sometimes we only get one shot to properly collect the data. While there may be many potential sources of evidence to pull from, in the off chance that there is only one location for the primary evidence, it's best to ask a reputable expert first, because if you don't collect in the proper way from the get-go, you could inadvertently impact the ability of anyone else who wishes to collect data from that device down the road. As we'll see throughout this presentation, not all collections are the same, and there's a big difference between what each one can get. So while I say non-techie, it's great to take the device offline and shelve it, that's just kind of the base thing. Ideally, you want to be working with an expert early on, and they will tell you if that's going to be a scenario where, it's okay to do that, put it on the shelf, we'll talk about it when we get around to it. Or no, actually, time is a really big factor here. We need to get that device in our lab ASAP. Now, when it comes to acquiring mobile data, can you get the data? Well, we got to go with the old reliable here. It depends. The make, model, operating system version, application version, the carrier even, whether it's a T-Mobile or an AT&T phone, and any sort of phone settings you have, all play a factor in determining what can be accessed and extractable in a readable format. Now, I emphasize in a readable format because while we might be able to pull something, it doesn't really matter if it's encrypted with government grade AES 512 encryption and we're not able to crack that. It's completely irrelevant, right? We have the data, but it's not readable. You're never going to be able to look at it in Discovery. So it serves little purpose. A classic example where the versioning mattered, for instance, would be in Snapchat. Now, when Snapchat first came out, some of the older versions, they were just terrible at fully deleting items. Snapchat came out, they were, oh, we're going to self-destruct all your messages. Sounded like a great thing on paper, but in actuality, they weren't legitimately deleting them from a forensic standpoint. They were just kind of doing a very basic, simple deletion. So it's very straightforward for us to still recover those messages, recover pictures, recover all sorts of things. As those flaws came to light and they developed newer versions, they actually started implementing the secure deletion very well. At this point, it's much more closer to its secure deletion and self-destruction claims on a daily basis. So how do you get it? It depends again. Again, the make, model, operating system, and everything like that will factor into what methods that we use. This pyramid is kind of a simplified view of the types of extractions that may be deployed from least invasive to most. So most of the time we live in the kind of yellow and green areas of the pyramid. Manual extractions down at the bottom are exactly manual. It's what it sounds like. It's literally being hands-on with the phone. You're taking photos of the screen. You're writing down notes of what you see on the screen. And it's as base as it gets. Now you go all the way up through JTAG and chip off. Sometimes those are destructive to the device. They usually involve taking the device apart. So I've got here an image of, this is actually a JTAG. Basically, all of these copper threads that you can see are extremely thin wires. It involves a lot of soldering. You have to do, you connect the phone once you've done all of this to specific boxes. Some phones have different boxes and attachments that you need to use for them. It's a very involved, very laborious process. The margin for error is razor thin on this. If you overheat that data chip just a few degrees too high, you could accidentally wipe all the data on there. So it's something that when need be, you can get into, but in an ideal world, hopefully we're living in more of the software-based collections of getting those physical and file system extractions. The other thing we have to consider is the data actually on the phone? While typically the mobile OS is going to be stored on the phone, app data may or may not be stored there. Just because an app requests your location, like we saw with the map earlier, doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to store that location on the phone. It could be storing it on a server in the cloud, could also be tracked in the moment and then discarded. We see that from time to time. Applications will ask for that. Locations, they might ask for specific permissions. They use them, but they don't really ever store it anywhere. And a lot of times that'll go into free space or somewhere else like that. Depending on the phone, we may be able to get some of that stuff out, but it varies. Programmers are going to do what they do. A lot of programmers cut a lot of corners sometimes, and mobile apps change a lot. Sometimes it's for a reason. Sometimes it's just because maybe they just wanted to refresh the user interface and make it look more pretty. But what we need to remember here is just because one version didn't support something doesn't mean that another won't. If we have a specific version of LinkedIn, for instance, that doesn't store chats on the phone, that doesn't mean that the very next version that came out also doesn't store chats on the phone. It may start storing them there. They may have realized that it was too labor intensive to pull them from the server every time. So they just started storing the last 30 days, for instance. So that's something to keep in mind. And again, with millions and millions of apps in the store, and these being updated sometimes on a daily basis, the process of keeping up with these is a task in and of itself. We also need to consider the origination report when we're trying to talk about if the data is on the phone or on the server end. As an example, the Twitter app might have some of your tweets. So if you look at a phone, you put it in airplane mode, you can probably pull up some tweets. But the Twitter server is going to have all of the tweets. Again, it's the origination point. Yes, the phone is being used to create those, but ultimately the phone is a way station to create them on Twitter servers. This goes the same for webmail. We routinely get requests to pull emails from the phone, which is, I appreciate the forward thinking, but the phones in actuality are not the origination point. We should be focusing more on the email server in those scenarios and using that to put together this big giant puzzle that is digital forensics and legal cases. Now, again, do we need the phone? You're probably already familiar with local backups, and those historically were a good option. However, nowadays, those are less common in the wild. With the advent of cloud storage, sometimes we're able to work with cloud backups to get data we need. For example, Apple's iCloud, Samsung Cloud, Google, they all have cloud options. They're typically automatic, and a lot of times they require no action at all from the phone's owner. Now, on the backup front, your phone is constantly syncing data and updating in the background, whether it be day or night. iCloud does auto backups. Those typically occur nightly, but they can be more spread out. iTunes backups, those can occur on plug-in. They're often automatic, so you plug your phone into your computer. Maybe you just want to get a little extra juice during the day, and that can kick off that iTunes backup sometimes and create a backup point on the computer. Similarly, Android, Samsung, everyone else, they all have backups and those auto backup as well. So I put this in here. Here we have a screenshot of an iCloud account. Now, this is one user login. And as you can see here, there's not only a backup for an iPhone, but there's also one for an iPad as well. So both devices that they have that are linked to that account have backups in the cloud. Now, I mentioned that they're typically daily, but as we see here, this one is dated, and this is on the iPhone. We have two versions of the snapshot. One is from 5/26. The other one is from 5/11. So for whatever reason, there must have just been no substantial enough changes that Apple warranted making that backup. But a little over 2 weeks went by between backup 1 and backup 2. So we can also get some versioning as well, potentially. Backups can impact the case in a major way because if a phone goes missing, it gets traded in or it gets destroyed, there are more locations created where the data resides. So it makes it much more difficult to experience a data loss, whether that's an intentional one or an unintentional one. Now, mobile data is extremely volatile. While backups are a great technological win for us, at the same time, it's easier than ever to remotely destroy data on a phone. Remote wiping is a potentially big problem, especially on iOS devices. They have made it super simple to do it. And it becomes a big problem on the modern day devices because the remote wipe also deletes the master encryption key. So you use that key to essentially unlock any other files on there. When you've destroyed that encryption key, you've nullified any hope at all of recovering the remaining data. Remote locks are also super simple to initiate from most any device with internet access. And that's whether you're in an iOS landscape or whether you're in the Android landscape. Another thing that makes them much more volatile is what's known as MDM. Now, this is mobile device management. Essentially, this is a corporate tool. Some of them will silo corporate data into a designated container, which they control. Others will just control the entire device. Now, whether or not that data is siloed into a container, many of those programs will allow IT or the corporation to wipe remotely, either on demand or automatically. So it could be, you've probably seen some of your devices maybe that after 10 failed attempts to enter the PIN code, it will auto wipe. But again, they can do it on demand. So it may be something where if at the point that you sever your working relationship with them, they may securely wipe the container of corporate data on your phone to prevent you from having any of their IP. Now, storage sizes have exploded over the years. The cost of storage continues to drop exponentially. And a lot of phones can store, 512 gigs, a terabyte of data even in some cases. But some phones and operating system versions do have limitations on how much data they will store before they fall off. Syncing with cloud-based platforms can also change things. An email that is present on a device today could easily be gone tomorrow if someone were to log in and delete it directly from an email server. This is why earlier we were talking about the base step of preservation is isolating that phone and getting it off the network. That minimizes the chance for remote wipes. It minimizes the chances for the MDMs to impact things as much as they could. They still have some control. But it also prevents things that are out on the server from syncing with the phone and maybe destroying data there. Lastly, while backups can exist, they do usually exist in a rolling fashion. So time is of the essence. We're going to be able to handle a collection with cloud backups that were created 2 weeks ago, much better than we would 2 years ago. Remote collection. Sometimes mobile devices can be collected remotely, and the process is fairly simple when they do need to be that way. Basically, we identify the data that's collected or that needs to be collected. We determine where it's located. We send the custodian a collection kit. We work with them, get the time on the books that works for everybody, enable the remote collection kit with them. An expert collects the data, and then that remote kit is returned. Now, lots of benefits to this, obviously. Swift preservation, convenient scheduling, something that can be done at the custodian's convenience. So whether it's at 2 o'clock on a Tuesday or 4:30 on a Friday, whatever works for them, we can make it work. You also have an expert collecting it. So if need be, you've got someone that can go in and testify on what was done and make sure that you're covered there. Lower costs as well. You don't have to pay for travel costs. There's no cost to put anybody up in a hotel or fly anyone out. And you get the same protections as in person. So as with any collection, you have your protocols and agreements. They can be modified to allow for confidentiality, scoping, review, everything like that, just as if someone was physically there collecting. And then, of course, we have the old reliable standby of a physical collection. Those are always an option, whether they're in the field or in the lab. In the lab, it could be a drop-off, can be something where we pick it up, could be shipped to us. But regardless, whether it's physical, whether it's remote collection, whether it's cloud or local backups, those are all going to be case-specific decisions. And a good examiner is going to be able to help you root through the options and find which one's going to be the best one given your case. Now let's briefly talk about some of the preservation protocols. The most common complaint that we hear about collecting phones is that the data is private. You get concerns along the same lines. Are you going to see my photos and videos, banking details, internet history, etc.? At the end of the day, a reputable company vets all their employees, examiner or not, and your data is about as safe as it can get in a forensic lab. And I should add that forensic firms also don't sell your data like some cloud providers might. So it's even safer than it would be in like Google or Apple's hands in a lot of cases. Another huge question that we see often on this is relevance. But as we learned earlier, mobile data moves extremely fast. There have been countless cases where arguments over relevance carried on ultimately resulted in all the data being lost, like when a phone takes a swim and there's no backups in place. Courts have consistently stated that mobile data is the same as non-mobile. The contents of an email is no different than that of a text. They're both communication. So while the relevance is definitely important, sometimes relevance is an analysis question, not so much a preservation one. Or it can be a question for the court to decide. If you can easily codify relevance, discuss it and go ahead and lock it down. But if not, you don't want to be explaining to the judge why you lost the data on your watch. So sometimes it's better to overcollect, and you'll never risk any sort of spoliation claims. Now, we can have photos that are taken at the scene of a mobile collision. Those can be helpful in many cases. And as we mentioned, or as we witnessed during the digital examiner's testimony of the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial, metadata can be changed, whether unintentionally or not is irrelevant, because we don't have a time machine. Preserving early and over-preserving in some cases allows us to create a time capsule, which is going to be the next best thing that we can get. We quickly talk about the power of protocols here. So we want to make sure that we have a good argument about why mobile device ESI, electronically stored info, is relevant and likely to be discovered on someone's devices. Make sure that your story there is solid. Think about why there might be data there, so that way you can properly argue that in front of the court. Of course, sometimes we all have to give a bit, get NDAs or confidentiality agreements in place, pre-collection. Sometimes it's just for the warm and fuzzies, or sometimes it's to actually actively counter objections relating to security or privacy and non-related data. Be upfront in the protocol that you're only looking for data that has relevance to the case as well. If John is talking to his wife about dinner, obviously we probably don't care about that most of the time. But if John's talking to his wife about resetting his phone to hide data, that's definitely something that we want to get, and that's not going to be classified as personal info. So make sure that we're not set up for scenarios where we're excluding all communications with John and his wife, but we're focusing more so on what's relevant to the case. Of course, if there are still concerns, we can consider leading with a proposal for in-camera, special master, and so on, and leave the door open for other protocols. If we may have to do potential collections down the line, additional analysis, you might discover that the owner has a second phone or a cloud account that they've been hiding. So keep that door open. A couple quick notes on the protocols. Just on the federal rules of evidence, I'm sure everybody's aware of these by now, but I still like to throw them in a little bit. 902 deals with evidence that's self-authenticating. In late 2017, they added sections 13 and 14, basically covering records generated by an electronic processor system. So like call logs, text messages, things that are automatically created by the phone during its usage. Also data copied from an electronic device or medium, as long as it's authenticated by a process of digital identification. We commonly think of this as a hash. It's the digital equivalent of a fingerprint, only it's more unique as it's a true calculation of all of the mathematical possibilities. Making sure your protocols are considering these changes will save a lot of time and money down the road. Talk about some analysis protocols. Be mindful of what you ask for. Try to avoid the all the things mentality. It may seem like a great idea on paper, but asking to review everything is rarely a smart move. Besides looking like a fishing expedition on paper, most of the time you probably don't care about someone's stats on a mobile game or the cleaning settings they have for their Roomba. Remember that auto collisions, just like any other case, are unique. So cater your request to what actually matters on this one specific case. Wording also matters a lot, especially in the tech field. One firm may interpret the word text as any written communications, including iMessages, SMS and MMS messages, and third-party chat apps. Another firm is going to hear text, and they're going to narrowly interpret it as SMS and MMS, and you're going to miss out on tons of other communication categories. Similarly, if you have someone who's in and out of good cell service, they might be, experiencing various levels of using iMessage sometimes and then SMS other, or you could have someone communicating via multiple channels. So depending on if they're at home or if they're out at a coffee shop, they're either using WhatsApp or a text message. Be specific on your ask. If opposing expert is asked to produce all information between X and Y time, make sure they're also looking at unparsed databases as well. With millions of apps and many of them unsupported by the tools, it's easy for an examiner to only search for what's automatically parsed by a tool and call it a day. But if you see data that you need, it's increasingly not going to be in stuff that's automatically parsed. This leads me to my next point. When possible, try and work into the protocol that you want your expert to have a copy of the forensic image so they can do their own work. If you've got a good firm working for you, your examiner will advise the best course of action and make sure that a no stone unturned approach is taken so you don't get surprised by anything in court. Quick note on production formats. They vary a lot based on the underlying data's format when we're talking about mobile devices. You have a computer, you might get a handful of office documents or emails back and forth. Each email is a separate item, and even if they're in the same mailbox, they're still separate. With mobile devices, most of the time, the data is going to be in databases. So if you're looking at text, it's not going to be one file per text, but you might see an Excel spreadsheet instead, one text per line of an entire thread. Data can sometimes be converted for ingestion into review platforms, but due to the fast-moving nature of mobile devices, not all conversions are equal. It may be fairly simple to put a thread of text into relativity, review a random app's data, but sometimes it's not as straightforward. Sometimes the deliverable might look more like a written report. It may have screenshots of hexadecimal data spread throughout because there just isn't any other way to present it. And again, with literal millions of apps on the market, don't be surprised if the app that's relevant isn't parsed and the examiner has to do extra work and massage it into a more digestible format. They may even have to do testing of their own on an app on a dummy phone as well. Be prepared, the deliverable might be, a little ugly looking, but what's important is that the data is ultimately found out and produced to you. Now, before we get to our case studies, I want to go through a couple of quick considerations for cases that involve collisions. A few pitfalls. Screenshots may seem like a great way to document something, but you're actually creating secondary and subpar evidence by doing that. During the process, new metadata is generated for those screenshots, and the good metadata that an examiner would look at can sometimes be left behind with the original data. While they make a great exemplar for showing the judge or jury what something looked like on a handset, they're not really good evidence, and they can create trouble if you try and use them in that way. Now on self-collection, when we consider that, it's great when it comes to physical docs. It's easy for a custodian to grab a box of docs and hand them to the counsel. When it comes to digital data, though, there's very few instances where self-collection works out the same as a bona fide forensic collection. For instance, a typical user might use one of the free or cheap phone backup softwares, but very few of those are going to go to even a tenth of the depth that a forensic tool will do to get all the data possible. Virtually none of those are going to have advanced collection techniques like zero-day software or hardware exploits. So it's just something to kind of be aware of and be mindful of. In a similar fashion, many e-discovery hosting firms will often tell you they can collect your client's data, but their expertise and skill set is going to be different than what a true forensic firm would do. While e-discovery firms certainly have their spot in the legal field, bear in mind that a lot of e-discovery firms employ technicians. Those technicians usually have certifications they earned after a few days or a week's worth of training. On the flip side, a good forensic firm is going to employ examiners. Those examiners usually have at a minimum a bachelor's, if not a master's degree or higher, typically in digital forensics. Knowing when to call in the pros can prevent critical data loss or unintentional modifications. And examiners are also going to have the technical know-how to speak to each and every scenario that you're going to be finding yourself in. A couple of quick notes on device locking. Obviously, if you have a deceased or incapacitated owner, how we handle that case is going to vary greatly based on the make, model, and so on of that device and how quickly we can access it. Some of these do have timeouts. So if we wait too long, we might not be able to get into it. Most modern phones are equipped with security features. They prevent an infinite number of guesses to unlock a device. It's a great feature, but if you have a legitimate need to get the data, they can be a nightmare. Regardless of whether the PIN code is due to a convenient temporary memory loss or a legitimate lack of knowledge or ability, the result is the same, a finite number of guesses. So if you're unsure, check with the experts first before we start guessing. There's also some forensic lockpick tools. So depending on the details of your device, we might be able to use specialized methods to either bypass or brute force a lock. On the right here, we've got what's known as an IP box. Basically runs through all the combinations on older iPhones until it finds one that hits. A couple of gotchas. Antivirus and security apps are more and more common. While they are a great idea, they do complicate forensic analysis and collections. Sometimes they need to be disabled or uninstalled. Other times they work perfectly fine. It's important to note that sometimes uninstalling them may also trigger self-destruction. So don't want you to go ahead and remove those all the time. Let an expert help make that decision with you. As mentioned earlier, these mobile device management softwares are great. They're awesome for security purposes, but they can unintentionally make collections impossible. For example, if an IT company restricts backups to any computers or cloud, yes, the user can't exfiltrate any sort of data, but what happens when there's a legitimate need for forensics to collect the data? Sometimes turning those settings on or off in the moment also indicates a wipe or reset. So we always advise you proactively work with IT companies, especially if you're their general counsel. Make sure that the IT security department knows about these policies and that they're setting you up for success. Also want to talk about call detail records. These are pretty heavily used in mobile collisions. They get used a lot, and most cases I see them. They can be requested from cell phone carriers, but they usually require subpoenas or other court documents. But they're only going to get transactional data. It's not always the most accurate. It's not the same as getting a phone, and it's not the same as getting all data. So we want to think big picture and get all the data when we can. Now, when we think about CDRs, this is kind of what they look like. This is call logs, for instance. You can see we have our number here that was called, the start time, the direction of it, and so on. We also have the cell locations for it. And this would be what text messages look like. Again, simply transactional data. We don't have any content of the messages. We just have the numbers and which direction and time. So you put those two together, and this is what you've got. If you just pulled CDRs and you were looking at a given time, you'd see this. Very little going on. If we go and do a phone poll, though, we'll see in addition to that, we now have the actual content of the text messages, but we also have this iMessage here. So iMessages are sent via data. You're not going to see those in call detail records because they're basically going to be data blobs. So that's something that we're missing out on already by just doing CDRs. But the content here can also make or break a case. Now, say we have our phone data, it looks great. The custodian here is an avid social media user. While there's remnants of social media on the handset, again, as we mentioned earlier, the original source is the best source. So let's look at those servers a little bit. Once we pull their Facebook and Gmail accounts, we see not only was the user calling and texting, but they were also sending an email. They're on Facebook posting things. Once we start to put all of these pieces together, we see the full puzzle and we have what appears to be a distracted driver. If you've worked in insurance claim cases for a while, you're probably familiar with MMR, or material misrepresentation. Basically what that is, if you haven't worked with it, is if you misrepresent material information during the claim or the policy, the carrier may not have to honor that policy. So say you've got someone that lists their home address in Cincinnati, Ohio. In actuality, they live in Newport, Kentucky, where they moved 2 years ago during COVID. It's only a 5-minute drive across the river, but if the carrier doesn't write policies in Kentucky, the insured may have misrepresented their info to the carrier. Of course, you can always ask the insured where they live, but if you collect their phone, you can also determine where they frequent based on GPS info, where their home location might be set in a navigation app, PDF statements for utility bills, and so on. Along the same lines, if someone says that they suffered whiplash injuries, for instance, on, let's say, April the 12th, can no longer move their neck, and it's because of this collision that they were involved in. In actuality, maybe they suffered those injuries on April the 10th, riding a roller coaster. Of course, you could ask the custodian again. They may or may not be truthful. But if you pull the phone, you might see Google searches for immediate care centers a few days prior to the collision. Information about Googling how long whiplash lasts or how severe it should be before you go to an emergency center. And lastly, most of the tools are work as designed, but we want to trust and verify. Due to the fast-moving nature, things can change, things can break. So we want to make sure that we're staying away from push-button forensics and actually being in a scenario where we can double-check things that we need to. You never want to find yourself in a scenario where your experts on the stand talk about a smoking gun they found, only for them to be confronted on cross that the other side's expert did their homework, found that the tool improperly reported one specific artifact, and as a result, the facts look drastically different. I know we're running short on time, so I'll get through these case studies pretty quickly, and then we'll get into the Q&A. So this one I call the old switcheroo. Insurance adjuster reaches out to us. Now, in this case, a semi-truck driver was involved in a fatal collision. The driver is requested to deliver his phone several weeks after during his examination under oath. When he presents the phone for review, the attorneys are manually scrolling through, but there's very little text activity. And when they ask the driver about it, he says, I routinely delete messages. Basically, I read them, I respond, and then I delete it to keep my phone clean. Seems reasonable, but the adjuster, not quite passing the smell test, so they want to work with digital forensics and see what else is there. Upon receiving the phone and analyzing it, various points on the phone show that it was initially set up 3 days prior to the EUO, which explains why there's very little data on it. Ultimately, the driver was confronted with that info, and when faced with the potential for criminal charges, he actually produces the original phone that he was using during the collision. That phone showed that the driver was on a phone during the time of the collision, but after looking deeper, we were able to determine that he was on a Bluetooth headset, and it was initiated long before the actual point of impact. This one's lost and found. Basically, a car is reported stolen by its owner. The next day, it was recovered on a rural highway and had been involved in a vehicle guardrail collision and was declared a total loss. During the investigation process, the story changed several times. There was enough red flags to cause the carrier's SIU team to enlist digital forensics. Phones were requested for all policy holders, and digital forensics was able to show that on the night the vehicle was reported stolen, the owner's phone was bar hopping at several different local bars in a nearby town. When confronted with this information, the owner confessed that they had had too much to drink, wrecked the vehicle, and abandoned it and called it in stolen to avoid a DUI charge. The carrier ended up denying the claim due to material misrepresentation and referred it over to law enforcement to prosecute for insurance fraud. Now, the last one, there's an app for that. We've all experienced insurance rates rising for seemingly no reason at all, but what happens if it becomes a pattern and it seems aggressive? So after seeing their rates rise for 6 months straight over and over, an individual sought counsel to sue a carrier believing they were treating them unfairly. During the initial consultation, the attorney learned that the insured installed the carrier's driving score app when they initiated the policy. The insured's adamant that the carrier must be falsely scoring them and punishing them, so they wanted to hire digital forensics to determine the validity of their claim. Now, proactively, we took a look at the phone, and while reviewing the insured's phone, we found the underlying databases that store the driving speeds relative to the speed limits, acceleration rates, braking habits, and other driver behaviors that were located. Turns out the carrier was simply adjusting according to the insured's driving patterns, and they were simply an abnormally risky driver. The end result was the individual was able to escape what would have been an expensive legal battle, and one that likely that wouldn't have ended in their favor. Now, as we wrap up the presentation today, I want to leave you with a few key takeaways for your next collision course. Remember to preserve early. Again, that mobile data is extremely volatile. Determine what you're looking for and draft your protocols accordingly. Also, remember the importance of the protocol. Let it be your roadmap to mounting a successful digital forensic case. When in doubt, preserve first, determine the analysis details later. Don't let disagreements over how to analyze put you into spoliation troubles. Be mindful of what CDRs aren't telling you. If you're basing most of your cases on CDR data in this day and age, you're leaving so much more on the table. Again, data can be produced in multiple ways and formats. Remember to be flexible and trust that your expert is giving it to you in the best possible format. And lastly, when in doubt, ask an expert. They have the training and know how to help you navigate through any scenario you and your client may find yourselves in. So as we wrap the presentation portion of today's meeting, I want to thank everyone for their time again today. Again, if you have any questions and you haven't entered them yet, feel free to drop those in the Q&A panel. Will, at this point, I'll hand the proverbial mic back to you for the Q&A session.
Perfect. Thanks, Ryan. There are a couple of questions for us to get to, but before I do that, I just wanted to quickly talk about 4Discovery's next webinar on July 13th. Has some relevance for what we're talking about here. When data for a matter needs to be returned or destroyed, there's really only a couple of options to put the cat back in the bag. What to do with the data depends on numerous factors, but is ultimately driven by the desired outcome or goal. And this webinar will walk through numerous scenarios and the right way to remediate data. So again, if there's any questions that you have, feel free to drop them in the Q&A box. So Ryan, we'll start with this first one. Is there a difference in terms of the type of geolocation that's available from an Apple iPhone compared to a Samsung Android phone?
Yeah, so there is going to be a difference between those. Again, as we discussed earlier, the makes, the models, the operating systems, those are all going to factor in. Whether it's stored, for a couple of days or whether it's stored infinitely is going to vary based on that. And then, of course, the applications that are there as well. Different apps are going to store different things. And a Maps application on a Samsung phone is going to store different types of geodata than Maps on an iPhone. So there's a lot of different ways as far as the accuracy of those. For the most part, the hardware that's going to be used across all the phones is going to be comparable enough to where you're going to see accuracy tolerances of about the same. So it's really just going to boil down to how much of that data is stored on each of the phones.
Okay, and another question that we have in here is requesting a CDR from a carrier necessary?
I would say, I hate to use this answer, I would say it depends, but I would definitely use it more as a fallback. It's nice to get it early, or at least put them on preservation notice if you can. So not necessarily requesting it, but put the carrier on preservation. But I would say focus more on where that data originates from, which is going to be your cell phone. It's going to be your cloud storage for social media and websites and things like that. And kind of put the CDRs on the back end in case the phone does go missing or takes a swim, something like that.
Okay, and that's all the questions that we have in the Q&A session at this point. Ryan, any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Yeah, I mean, as we discussed, if you're uncertain how to handle a given situation, definitely don't be afraid to reach out and ask an expert. At the end of the day, any good expert is going to be able to tell you the best path to take when you're presented with a given scenario. And as we covered during this presentation, each and every device, every data point, every case, they all present a unique set of specific details to consider. So just take that in mind and know that the expertise is also going to be considering that as well and helping you out. So I guess closing thought is, don't be afraid to ask for help.
Great. Thanks, Ryan. And thank you to everyone for attending. A follow-up email with all the materials from today's webinar will arrive in your inbox by the end of the week. If you submitted your Illinois bar number during registration, your CLE attendance certificate will be sent out by next week. Thanks again, and we hope to see you at 4Discovery's next webinar, Remediating Data the Right Way, on Wednesday, July 13th. We hope you have a great rest of your day.